All right. I see folks are falling into the Zoom. I love it. Good evening, everyone. I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining our conversation on voting rights, past, present, and future. I want to say happy Black History and Futures Month to our folks at McCourt and from McCourt to everybody. Some of you may know me. I'm professor of the practice, Jasmine Tyler, and I am the executive director of the Policy Innovation Lab. You may also know me from Foundations or one of my classes, but I'm so excited to really offer this conversation with some of our nation's experts and advocates on voting rights, critical cornerstone to our democracy and the United States. This event is also co-sponsored by Black Perspectives on Public Policy, one of our McCourt student organizations, and they help to curate the questions for our panelists today. And it is also co-sponsored by our own Georgetown Center on Faith and Justice. Our panelists today include Reverend Jim Wells, who runs the Center on Faith and Justice here at Georgetown, as well as two of my dearest friends, and I'm so excited, and comrades, mentors, girlfriends, like everything, Jessalyn McCurdy and Lashawn Warren. They have worn so many hats. They've worked at the ACLU, they've worked on the Hill, they've worked in other nonprofits. They are leading our civil rights organizations right now. Jessalyn is the executive vice president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Lashawn Warren is the chief policy officer for Southern Poverty Law Center, and they are really at the forefront of pushing for and securing voting rights for all in the United States to make sure that our democracy upholds that, again, cornerstone. So you all have access to their information. And we are going to leave the chat closed for now so that we can focus on the conversation. After the initial conversation, first 30 minutes or maybe so, we will open up for questions from the audience, and you'll get to ask your own question. If you don't want to come off mute or do that, you're welcome, though, to chat to us, and we will be able to read out your question for the panelists. So there are lots of ways to engage. With that said, I am just gonna go ahead and kick it off and ask our amazing panelists to tell us a little bit more about your organizations and how you come really, to be working on voting rights in this moment. So I'll start it off with Jessalyn, and then we'll go to Lashawn, and then we'll hear from Reverend Jim.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you for inviting me today. So I work with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. It is considered one of 8 legacy civil rights groups. We are celebrating our 72nd anniversary, and we really were a part of the civil rights movement and focused our efforts in the civil rights movement around passing federal legislation. So we were very involved in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act. And so we were kind of one of the first arms of the civil rights movement to really focus on passing federal legislation.
And then how do you come yourself to be working on voting rights and your career trajectory? And
sure. So as Jasmine said, I worked at the ACLU for, I like to say, on and off for 18 years. During that time, I left and came back. I left and went to the Hill. I worked for House Judiciary, came back. But I really started working on really directly on voting rights once I transitioned over to the Leadership Conference, But while I was at the ACLU, I worked very closely with Lashawn Warren. And while I didn't work on voting rights, I absorbed so much of her expertise that it made it a lot less difficult to make the transition last year to work on voting rights, because she's such a brilliant strategist, has been in the trenches working on voting rights and different reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act for many years now, and taught me a lot about that work.
Thank you. It's so helpful for us and our students, really, who are graduate students in public policy, to think also about the trajectories of their careers potentially, and to know that people are moving around and that there are all these ways and hats to wear to influence the political world around us, the policy world. Lashawn, we've heard so much about you so far. Please tell us more.
Listen, I pay folks very well. Actually, I've learned everything that I know from Jocelyn and Jasmine. So Jasmine, well, good afternoon to everyone. Good evening. And Jasmine, thank you so much for inviting us to participate in this. It truly is an honor. So with respect to the mission of the Southern Poverty Law Center, we want to be and consider ourselves to be a catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond. And we work in partnerships with communities where we have a presence to dismantle white supremacy and systems that oppress communities of color. And that ranges in a variety of contexts in terms of the types of work that we do. We have work related to, I think most people know us by our work on white supremacy, combating hate and bias and extremism. We have a voting rights program, we have an economic justice program, and then we have also a decarceration program. With respect to how I started this work, so I am from Savannah, Georgia. I guess I should also say we have a presence in 5 states. We have offices in all five southern states: Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and Florida. And with our offices, we have a really good foothold in terms of what is happening on the grounds. We have 6 different practice groups that work very closely with our allies. We make sure that we center communities in the work that we do, not only with our litigation, but also with our policy work. We work at the federal level and also at the state level. So having taken a step back, I am from Savannah, Georgia. So I'm from the Deep South and very familiar with the types of activities that we are now confronting in the South. And with respect to voting in particular, I've been doing this work for many years, but one of the things that I came to conclude very early in my career is that voting was really the gateway to our liberation. That if we really wanted to make significant changes in terms of funding allocation, if we wanted our communities to look different, we needed to have representation at the local level to the highest level and have those people represent our interest to make sure that we are getting the resources that we need, and that whenever there are policies that are being made, there is a voice that can really speak to the concerns of the communities that we represent. So I'll stop there and pass the mic to Reverend Wallace.
Well, I am blessed to be with colleagues tonight who are great leaders from organizations that I've known and loved and respected and worked with for many years. For 50 years, I started and led this organization called Sojourners, putting faith into action for justice. And I've taught a course at Georgetown for 10 years called Faith, Race, and Politics, putting all 3 together. But now I'm full-time, and I've got this chair in faith and justice at the McCourt School, where I've got a new tag team partner, Jasmine. We connected right off the bat. And also a center on faith and justice. My 2 favorite words in my life are faith and justice, now a chair and a center. So I'm a happy camper. But I'll just say at our opening event, we had Senator Raphael Warnock and Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who are leading the battle on voting rights in the Senate and the House. And it was packed out with students. Many of you maybe were there. The student energy in the room was so powerful, the moral energy. We need a student movement for voting rights in this country. And many of those students said they wanted to start that right here at Georgetown. I said, absolutely. And now I'm on calls with people all over the country who are private universities who want that there too. So everything is at stake in voting rights. Everything else that we care about is at stake. And as Lashawn said, voter suppression is the principal strategy to protect white supremacy in this country. We just say it out, is to protect white minority rule. It's a strategy. There are people, powerful, wealthy, who want, I'll just say in one sentence, they want to prevent our changing demography from changing our democracy. That's what they're trying to do, and we have to stop them. So I'm thrilled with this conversation tonight, particularly in the middle of start of Black History Month. So Thank you for including me.
Definitely. So I want to make sure I got that right, because I'm not writing in the chat. The voter suppression, you said, is the approach to make sure the changing demography of the US doesn't influence the democracy of the US?
They know they can't change our changing demography.
Mm-hmm.
They'd like to change that, but they can't. So they want to prevent changing demography from changing our democracy.
Right. And so
that's voter suppression, is to preserve white minority rule. Very strategic, not just rhetorically, very strategically. Gerrymandering, redistricting, and voter suppression is at the heart of that strategy.
Lashawn, can you talk to us a little bit, and then and then I want to hear also from the other panelists, we all do, what the biggest threats are right now and what that looks like in the Deep South?
Sure. So I think the biggest threat at this moment, well, let me back up and say the basic question here, and I think Reverend Wallace hit on it, is who's allowed to vote and which ballots count and whose voice matters. Like, those are the core questions that we are grappling with. And I totally agree with Reverend Wallace with respect to what is driving voter suppression at this point, right? So we consider ourselves to be a democracy, but not just a democracy, a representative democracy. And with that being said, you would think that we would celebrate the 62% of our populace who actually engaged in this last election. And really, the COVID crisis presented an opportunity to make voting more accessible. And that's what we saw. And with accessibility, we saw an uptick in participation, particularly in places like the Deep South. And what was the response to that? Instead of celebrating that, we had 19 states pass 33 different laws to make it much more difficult to vote. What was the response in Georgia? I think that is a really good example, because it really did change the composition of the Senate. As everyone probably knows, the Senate was Republican control. That was the leadership. And with the election of Reverend Warnock and Senator Ossoff, with their election in Georgia, the Senate flipped, and the response to that was sweeping legislation that would make it much more difficult to vote. And it's historical. The election was so historical, and it kind of tells you the mindset of some of the legislators who are passing these laws. You have the first African-American senator ever elected from Georgia, the first Jewish senator ever elected from Georgia. And the response was, let's make it more difficult to vote. And I don't think that it's far from people's minds what happened in Stacey Abrams' case, where there were so many voters that were purged. And so we're seeing a number of tactics that are being used, not only in the Deep South, but I think there are other areas like North Carolina, for example, that passed a monster law right after the Shelby County decision in 2013, but we're seeing massive purges. We're seeing rollbacks of drop boxes, very limited opportunities to drop off ballots. We're seeing harsher voter photo ID requirements. We're seeing a restriction with respect to early voting. So they're making that time period shorter. They're making it much more difficult to request a ballot. People have to photocopy their ID there were affidavit requirements. So like there's so many different hurdles that make it much more difficult for people to exercise their right to vote. And so those are the basic things that we're seeing in response to this the election that President Biden's election. But I think we have to situate this really in a broader context as well, and outside of the changing demography, we're really talking about how resources will be allocated. If you think about the fact that in our lifetime, we probably will not see the allocation of money that we have seen in the past couple of years, or last year and a half as a result of COVID. There's over $4.7 trillion that have gone out to the states. And with that money comes, their resources and the folks who are in control and who are in leadership can allocate that money in a variety of different ways, right? They can allocate that money for healthcare, for school nutrition, for employment, housing programs, mental health services. Some communities will go with and some will go without. And so having the ability to be able to make decisions about how those resources are allocated is pretty critical and key. And I will also name, outside of the barriers that we see for voting, we see that there's a massive effort to redraw districts in a way that eliminates Black and brown elected officials. They're just like drawing them out of their district. And not only are people being prohibited from voting, particularly communities of color, but you have a situation where even if they were able to vote, that they won't have the amount of the sizable number of population where they can elect a candidate of their choice who will represent their interest. And I will stop there. I think I've said a lot.
The power of numbers is prevented by the redistricting. I want to let Jessalyn or Reverend Jim jump in.
Yeah, the only thing that I want to add to what Lashawn said is not only are we seeing in many of the southern states and other states a restriction on mail-in ballots, early voting, drop boxes, but we're also seeing polls close. So if you look at that big picture, where you can't get a mail-in ballot, you can't find a drop box to drop it off, it's difficult to early vote, and your polling place is closed down. We have, the Leadership Conference did a study back in 2019, updated study in 2019 called Democracy Diverted. And we found that in Texas, for example, 750 polling places had been closed since the Shelby decision in 2013. Arizona, 320 polling places had been closed since Shelby. In Georgia, 216. And again, let's focus on these states. Arizona, Georgia, critical states in the presidential election in 2020. And not only in Arizona, by majority, most people use mail-in voting since for many, many years in Arizona. So now we're seeing that curtailed and polling places curtailed all at the same time. It's not a coincidence.
No, it's interesting. Reverend
It's not only
Jim?
not a coincidence, but all the things that my colleagues have mentioned, that big monster law that Lashawn talked about in North Carolina, the North Carolina Supreme Court looked at that, and the court said, not Jim Wells or us, the court said, all these restrictions are surgically targeted at Black voters. Surgically targeted. So all these things are making it harder for Black and brown voters to vote. And they've added what I call the Election Subversion Act, which is, I was just on the phone with our Georgia leaders this afternoon, and they're good at organizing. They can out-organize and out-mobilize a lot of these restrictions. And Cynthia Hale, who leads a lot of that in Georgia, said we kind of won despite or because of all that last time. The one thing they can out-organize or mobilize against is a new law in Georgia that allows the state legislature to overturn election results in Fulton County, in Atlanta. And that's happening all over the country. State legislatures are skewed to white rural power, and they are wanting to overturn partisan overturning of nonpartisan voting. Now that's election subversion. So all over the country, these things are done. Now let me just say, I am a white Caucasian male with a house, which means people like me have never had trouble with their voter eligibility. Way back from the beginning. Everybody else has had to fight for it ever since. When Lashawn mentioned the uptick, 2020 was the largest voter turnout since 1900. Also the largest voter turnout of Black and brown people, which is why 2021 has all these new voter restriction laws. That is why they're doing it, even to the point of wanting the power to overturn local elections in Detroit, my hometown, in Philadelphia, in North Carolina, in Atlanta, all the places where Black and brown people vote, that's where they plan to overturn the election. That's what we have to stop.
I mean, you all have said so much, and I want to reinvoke the title of this talk, and it's called Past, Present, and Future. I want to take us back a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about Shelby, because you all have invoked Shelby, and just for folks who may not be familiar or have followed it closely, I would love to, you even talked, Jessalyn, about, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights being a seminal driver of many of the civil rights acts, including the Voting Rights Act. So can we talk, I think we just want to name, like, remember, Black folks didn't have the right to vote until 64. And that has always also been a little challenged in its implementation and access. But something specific happened when the Supreme Court heard the Shelby County case. And so I wonder, just to orient our audience so that we can continue to have this conversation, if we could just unpack Shelby a little and a little bit of the historical context of African-American voting rights.
I could do that, but I'm actually going to ask Lashawn to do it, because Lashawn, again, as I mentioned in my opening, Lashawn has been at a very strategic and in-depth level, been working on these issues since before 2006, the last reauthorization. So she saw Shelby possibly coming in 2006 when they reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. And then in 2013, we got Shelby from the Supreme Court. So I'm going to ask,
and I believe that was a bipartisan reauthorization.
Bipartisan reauthorization.
Bipartisan. Yes, thank you.
Bipartisan reauthorization. 16 of the current senators, who will now not let us even have a debate about voting rights, voted for the 2006 reauthorization. So Lashawn can give us the trajectory to how we got to Shelby. And then I'll chime in if necessary after that.
Yes, this is super textural. Yes.
Okay, so there's a lot of history here. The primary issue in Shelby, and I guess I should back up. The first case was a municipal county case coming out of Texas. That was the first challenge after the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2007. And basically, the key issue here is, or the key issue in both cases, was the coverage formula for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So let me back up and just say Section 5 is considered the heart and soul, really, of the Voting Rights Act. And the reason why is because the Voting Rights Act, it in operation, it is unlike any civil rights law that we have. And the reason why is because it acts in a prophylactic way, right? So it gets ahead of the discrimination before it can have an impact. Because I think there was just a recognition that once an election has occurred, there are no do-overs. So when you lose the right to vote, when someone has denied you and said, no, you can't vote in this election, there isn't an opportunity to remedy that. There isn't a remedy for a lost vote. And so just thinking that through, it's a wonderfully engineered act in where the most egregious behavior, primarily in the South, right? And in 2006, 2007, we built a very strong record. In fact, the strongest record that, and I think the many courts have acknowledged that it's one of the strongest records that has ever been built to substantiate the need for the Voting Rights Act. But the way that Section 5 functioned, the coverage formula, is it takes the states and the counties, localities that have the most egregious history with respect to voting discrimination, that they have a long trajectory and continue to still discriminate against Black and Brown voters, before they can make any changes to any of their procedures. So before they can shorten early voting, before they can remove drop boxes, before they can close a polling place, before they can make any of those changes with respect to their registration or how people vote, those would have to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or the federal court in DC. If they do an analysis, and if they find these changes to be discriminatory, will have a discriminatory impact, they can raise an objection to prevent the state, like the state of Georgia, for example, for if they wanted to put in place a photo ID requirement and it was found to be discriminatory, DOJ could object and say, you cannot proceed with that, because it will have a discriminatory effect. So again, the idea is that the objection would actually stop the discrimination before it could actually occur. Once Shelby County, which is a county in Alabama, once that decision was rendered, it basically said that that the coverage formula, it removed the coverage formula, so it made it inoperable. And basically suggested that the legislature, the House and Senate, need to go back and refine the coverage formula. They concluded that it was over inclusive. And I will just name as one of the people who helped to put the record together, there was substantial evidence of all of the jurisdictions that were covered, that they continue to discriminate in voting. And that has been substantiated even after Shelby County was handed down in 2013, because the very states that were covered, as soon as the Section 5 coverage formula was struck down, they immediately started to enact the kinds of laws that we're seeing in Georgia, the kinds of laws that we saw in Texas and North Carolina. In fact, North Carolina and Texas, almost immediately after Shelby was decided, immediately worked on photo ID requirements. And as Reverend Wallace talked about, they implemented or tried to implement a monster law that was specifically targeted towards communities of color to prevent them from voting. So that's generally the context in the lead up to where we are now. So the legislation that we've been working on, that Jasmine has been leading and doing an excellent job at leading, it is meant to repair and put in place a coverage formula that will cover the jurisdictions that have the most egregious history of voting discrimination. And when I say history, I am not talking about 20 years ago. I am talking about right now. I'm talking about the past and present. Like it continues, and they need federal oversight. And we see that when federal oversight is removed, they're bad actor states, and they not only do they continue to suppress voter participation, they make it, they multiply that by making it even more difficult with all of the challenges that are already present.
So that eloquent legal description of that history means practically all these voter restriction laws would have had to been approved.
Exactly.
By the Justice Department, and they wouldn't have been.
Exactly.
They wouldn't have been. So there they are. And Stacey Abrams says it very well. Voter suppression now is not billy clubs and dogs and hoses. It's administrative rules, bureaucratic barriers, and things that happen in precincts in the dead of night. It's things that people can't really understand. And because one party is doing voter restriction and the other party's fighting it, people say, oh, this must be just a partisan thing. They get confused. When Senator Ernst says, well, we have more early voting days in Iowa than they have in Delaware, why aren't you going after them? They want to sow confusion. So we have to bring moral clarity to this. And after Shelby, it blew up, as Lashawn says, and after the 2020 election, with all the voter turnout, it blew up again. 2021 has more of these laws we've ever seen before, and we got to bring moral and political clarity to what's going on here.
Thank you for helping us get that understanding about why there is such a uptick in the ability to create the, policy mechanisms and to activate those that create these suppression and subversion tactics. It's also interesting too, Professor Reverend Jim Wells, because, many of our students, well, all of them go through a public management class where they think about what it is, what it means to be, activating these levers. So that's super helpful.
And Jasmine, I just want to add
yes,
one more. I just want to add one more thing. And as Lashawn laid out again, Shelby and what was, it was the result of Shelby. But one of the things that Justice Roberts said in Shelby, and this is kind of our guiding post, is that there needed to be a reevaluation of the current conditions on the ground around voting discrimination. And so, for example, what we did with Lashawn's leadership, because Lashawn was at the leadership conference before me, so we have just followed each other around these.
Listen,
it's a very incestuous community.
Yes. If you're my student, that I always talk about, it's all about your network and who you know and who you're doing work with. And that's exactly what it is. Yes. So lots of us have worn different hats and traded them, and our colleagues and all of that. So
yes. So that's why, right, exactly. Getting to know people and having a good reputation is so important if you want to do this work. But anyway, so what Lashawn put in place before I came in was working with states to come up with reports to so that we could demonstrate what the current conditions on the ground are. And so we worked with about 13 consultants around the country to develop reports in many of the jurisdictions that were already covered, that would have been covered under the Voting Rights Act, Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, to indicate what the current conditions were on the ground. And we have. And what those reports did was they just confirmed that there is still discrimination going on. There's still discrimination going on against Black, Brown, Native Americans, people with disabilities. And it demonstrates, what those reports demonstrate are that there is a continuing need for the Voting Rights Act and updating of the Voting Rights Act with the legislation that is named after John Lewis, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Well, so can I just add one more thing?
Take it away. I love it.
I love this conversation. So, one of the things that the Voting Rights Act does as well, it has several provisions that we have a provision called a bail-in provisions, and we have bail-out provisions. And Justin, I'm so glad you raised the current conditions issue that Justice John Roberts raised. He raised that and failed to talk about the reports that were in the record. Like they didn't, it seemed as if they didn't even read the reports in the record. One of the points that he makes is like there may have been like discrimination in Ohio. Why is Ohio not covered versus Georgia? Well, you have bail-in provisions in the Voting Rights Act. So if Ohio was a bad actor, DOJ could bring them under coverage. He did not quibble with the fact that Georgia, for example, continued to discriminate. Like it was basically, it's too broad, and then there's bailout, right? So if a jurisdiction was covered and they felt like they shouldn't be covered, they didn't have any violations, they could actually bail out of coverage. And so those two bookends, if you will, prevent the act from being over-inclusive and under-inclusive. And so those two factors were never even explored in the opinion. And so it just, and I think it's worth mentioning that when Justice Roberts was an attorney at the Department of Justice, he literally wrote the manual for how to weaken the Voting Rights Act and complained. And in several memos, he wrote memos, talking points about the problematic nature that he found there to be with the Voting Rights Act. And so he's always had this propensity to have hostility related to this particular act. And it's been in existence, that hostility for a long, long time.
You mentioned a really important piece too, Lashawn, that it's not just us who wear different hats and work together. But one of the things I also try to instill is that folks who pop up in various positions don't just like get those out of the blue, right? They've also done the work. And so you think about like a William Barr, who became the Attorney General in the last administration, who had really led a charge around overcriminalization and an enthusiasm for the use of the criminal justice system. And here you talk about Justice Roberts, who spent career at DOJ prior to ascending to the highest court in the land, and that really primes us for a question that I'm just going to, a couple of questions that I'm going to condense, and that is, what are we looking at? We saw the last vote, the debate vote fail a couple of weeks ago. I actually felt like that was a death knell for democracy. And, we have a DOJ that under the Biden administration is thinking about these things, but also limited because of their scale and scope and legislation, and a Supreme Court that is not favorable either, and has upheld even recently, or not upheld, overturned a ruling on a Alabama district redistricting issue. I'm probably mixing up the words on that, but I'm just curious, where are we?
I'll just quickly talk about in terms of the Hill, and I hope Lashawn and Rev Wallace will talk about Alabama specifically, because that's the opinion that decision just came down a few days ago. So the vote a few weeks ago was very disappointing. It really would have hinged on changing the Senate rules in a 50-50 Senate so that we would be able to pass voting rights legislation that is sorely needed. We not only were unable to have a rules change, but we had two Democratic allies who voted against a rule change. So now basically, I'll just keep it short. Basically where we are is to be able to achieve any protection for voting rights in this Congress, we're going to need at least 60 votes, which is going to include 10 Republicans, because I do not see a revisiting of a Senate rules change in this Congress. And we are going to have to come up with some combination of votes and legislation that will garner at least 60 votes.
Let me speak to that question. Because the filibuster, and we could have a long conversation about the filibuster, it would have taken a changing of Senate rules or a carving out of the filibuster for voting rights. And two Democrat senators, Manchin and Sinema, wouldn't do that. And they're making clear they won't do that. So keeping to put forward all these things again and again isn't going to work. So something that we're floating, this is a good place to talk about it. There are 9 Republicans and 7 Democrats who are working on something called electoral count reform. This is how the electoral count, which is only in presidential elections 2024, is ambiguous and should be clarified. And some of the Penn stuff brought that up. And so they keep asking us if we're for that. And Cedric Richmond from the White House in a conversation, we said, well, that's not enough. And a lot of us think it's not enough. Well, so it's just saying, let's put an electoral count reform with an election count reform focused on this singularly egregious overturning of elections act. The election count, which will be honest again in 2022, and all this has to be dealt with in that singular way. And so we're talking with Clyburn's office and lots of our friends, when I'm talking to some of the Democrats who are on that Republican Democrat thing about electoral stuff, which is good, but not enough. So how do we add to that something that would be focused on what I would call the election subversion acts or sabotage acts of letting partisan counting, overturning of local elections by legislators in Georgia or judges in Texas. So we've got to take a next step in advocacy, because we won't get our bills through this Senate with that filibuster. So it does talk about electing different senators. That's a good conversation going forward. But also, let's focus on this terrible subversive piece of the election restriction laws, which I think could bring some people together or focus more public scrutiny on this and some moral clarity to what's really being threatened here in elections as early as 2022. Let me just say, the people who pushed the big lie that the election was stolen, which the last election was not stolen, they plan on stealing the next 2. The people who pushed the lie about the last election are planning on stealing the next 2 elections. That's exactly what we're facing now, and we have to confront that very directly. And as a Center for Faith and Justice, what we said at our opening with Raphael Warnock and Terry Sewell, voter suppression is a test of democracy. It's also a test of faith, If our congregations don't come down on the side, we should do a pulpit test on the side of voting rights here, we could lose democracy. And you're going to lose a whole generation of young people who will never go back to church. If we don't come down on the right side here, that's crucial. So we've got to focus this. And we need, I'll say to students, we need a student voting rights movement for this election, and not just for 2024.
I want to open it up to our students who are still here. Many folks have class at 6:30, so we've lost some folks who had to trek across campus. But I want to pose one question and then invite folks to come off mute and ask a question too. And that is, can you all address DC statehood and what suppression of the Black vote in DC has looked like, or the long-term impact and likelihood of changing that?
I mean, I can just quickly say that, there is a bill that was passed by the House that is supportive of DC statehood. It has the same fate as many other pieces of legislation in the Senate, that it needs a 60 vote, majority to be able to get to the president's desk. So, and then what that looks like in this Congress is not good. The prospects for that are not good. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Are there folks who want to ask a question? Okay, Lashawn, jump in.
Can I just, there's a couple things that I want to just name. So with respect, I want to go back for a second with the Alabama case, just so that folks are aware of the Alabama case. There was this 3-judge panel that basically said to the state of Alabama, you need to go back and redraw your congressional maps. The way that you've drawn it limits the Black community's ability to elect the candidate of their choice. And the Supreme Court on their shadow docket, without much explanation at all, basically reinstated that map and considered it to be disruptive to have the state go back and draw maps. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of a sense in terms of the prioritization and the way people are thinking. But I just want to name and just underscore some of the things that Jocelyn said, and make a point that I'm just going to name this. The Senate is dysfunctional. It is dysfunctional. Like, to have 2 senators have that much control of the legislative process, and to be able to control sort of what happens to the plight of so many people, many of whom don't live in West Virginia and Arizona, is a problem. And I think we have to rethink the systems that we have that don't serve us well. And I will name one other thing too, and I would love to hear others' thoughts about this. We can't organize our way out of this. We can bring more and more people to the polling places, register more people to vote. But whenever we meet the moment for the rules that are there, the rules change. Mm-hmm. And that will be our Achilles heel, and we will always be running after the train and never on it. I think we have to be the conductor in the train, right? We have got to drive our agenda and think about systems that serve us well and how we get to implement those systems, as opposed to trying to run through a maze that's been designed for us. I mean, one of the things that we just have to just name is that these systems were man-created and they can be created again, right? And so we're at a point now, particularly in light of the January 6th insurrection, we have got to think differently. We're at a critical moment. Our democracy is literally hanging on a thread. And it's not going to be a democracy very much longer if something doesn't change. And I think just naming that is critically important. And Jasmine, can name this and will know exactly what I'm saying. I feel many times we don't address root causes. Like I think Reverend Wells was talking about the value system that undergirds what we're seeing right now, like the fear and there are lots of different value systems that I think are the drivers here. But oftentimes what we find is people are fixing windows when the houses are burning down. And what is happening here? We're tinkling around the edges. And even when you take that analogy even further, we're fixing the windows while the house is burning down and there is rot at the foundation. And so there are things that we have fundamentally got to fix and perhaps not even fix, rebuild, because there's a question about whether it can be fixed. So I will.
It's dysfunctional for a reason. Dysfunctional, it's skewed to white political power. I'll just say that. The filibuster has been used for this over and over again. The Electoral College is skewed. Montana has the same number of senators as California. So it's dysfunctional, but dysfunctional for purpose of white power. I'll just say that as a white guy. We can't just say it just didn't happen. This was designed to prevent change from happening. So we have a skewed system that has to be overcome fundamentally, because I'll just say the bigger lie underneath the big lie in January 6th, the bigger lie is racism. And to name white Christian nationalism in particular, which I as a faith leader are going to call a sin. It's a sin. So there's a bigger lie underneath the big lie, and that's got to be addressed to change a system dysfunctional, but for the purposes of retaining white minority rule, which is what they want to do. That
Yeah.
needs to change.
Mm. And I was going to say, of course, the big lie is predicated on the lost cause narrative, right? Like it's these lies that have been told over and over again. But I want to go ahead and let Takorian, one of our student leaders and leader of Black policy, Black perspectives on public policy, jump into this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Professor Tyler, and thank you to the panelists for being here and giving us a lot of insightful information. My question kind of it kind of piggybacks off of what Ms. Warren just said. You know, the Democrats during the 2020 election said we need a majority in Congress in order to get things done. However, we saw that despite having a majority, there's still a lot of roadblocks. And now they're saying, well, we actually need a bigger majority, you know, 60 party and 60 people in the Senate and maintain the House. But going back to what Ms. Warren just said, even if you know, galvanize more voters, sign up more people, there's still a lot of structured barriers that prevent that causes voter suppression. So what do y'all like? What is y'all's opinion on what politicians should do? Should they prioritize getting more people out to vote, or should they, you know, try to get voting legislation passed, even though there are roadblocks happening? So it seems like there's a double-edged sword here. Like they can't get voting rights passed currently, but the likelihood of them getting more voters to turn out won't be possible because of voter suppression. So like, what's the plan if that's the case?
So I would say, you know, I think we are at a turning point in 2022. You know, I talk about this almost every day, is that while we really do need to pass voting legislation, and those prospects don't look great at the moment, we also have to because we may not be able to pass voter legislation on the federal level, we need to educate people about the changes in the laws that have happened at the state level and simultaneously are still happening, because there are state legislatures that are in session now that have proposed even more laws to restrict voting. So we have to educate about the laws that have already been passed and keep up on the laws that are being considered and potentially will be passed. It is a, you know, monumental task at this point. It really is. And the reality of and this is why what Reverend Wallace said was so important to this discussion, that this is based on what I used to call the fear of 2050. And I used to use 2050 because that used to be the date when there was, in this country, there was going to be a majority minority population. I think now that date, from the latest thing that I have seen, is that's as soon as 2034. And that's what all of this is driven around, because then you will have a party that will be out of step with the current demographic in this country. And if, again, like what happened in 2020, there is a organized effort to bring voters of color out, we can have a say in our future. And that is not what our opponents want to happen. This is a last ditch effort by them that hopefully they won't win, but it's not looking good, to continue the legacy of white supremacy.
What Jocelyn says, let's call it the elephant in the room in every political conversation in Washington, D.C., voting rights, immigration, spending, taxes, all of that. Because the transition from being a white majority nation to a majority of minorities is something that the white power brokers are just not going to deal with. They're trying to prevent that. But a new generation is rising up that wants, in fact, to be a part of that transition. So this is a movement. We're not going to do something tomorrow or the next day that'll fix all this. So I think we're doing something called Faiths United to Save Democracy. We're in 10 key states, and it's very broad, led by Black clergy, but very broad. And we trained 2,700 poll chaplains last time to not only protect votes, but deal with violence at the polls, which we had. We had armed people going in. So building that movement's important, but we can't just and our leads say this, we can't out-organize, out-mobilize our way around these laws. So we're gonna push on that voter suppression, voter subversion piece. We're gonna push on those things at the national level and the local level, but it's movement building with the kind of education that Justin's talking about, movement building long-term.
I agree with everything my colleagues have said. There's one additional thing that I will add, and that is, well, I'll name this. We definitely have to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And so we can't give up on one avenue. We have to do a variety of things and work on multiple platforms. You know, we can certainly have people vote for sure, but it isn't so people can elect these elected officials. But one of the other areas, a pain point for them, is fundraising and money and dollars. And they're getting that from corporations. And we can't overlook the role that these corporations have in fueling the campaigns of a number of these folks who harbor hate, who refuse to certify the election. A number of them, particularly in the banking industry, said that they would not donate any more to any of the elected officials who refused to certify the election after the January 6th insurrection. And within 6 months, they were donating again. AT&T is a example of that. Like you can go down the list of Fortune 500 companies. You know, they may not agree with our politics, but they do understand dollars and cents, and they are driven by the bottom line. And I do think that we need to vote with our money and our feet, like not only exercise our right to vote, but some of these companies that are funding some of the nonsense and some of the candidates that are actually in place, and some of the actual people who are in place right now. We need to address the money issue in addition to the votes. So we have to play on multiple platforms and hold some of these people accountable. You can't say that you support Black Lives Matter on the one hand and fund the very people who refuse to allow the Voting Rights Act to get a vote. Like completely inconsistent. And I think we have to really call folks out and really make them accountable. And I think the young people have done that brilliantly. I mean, and we will be taking your lead with that. And I think that is a place where we really have not really leveraged the kind of power that we need to hold these folks accountable, their feet to the fire. And I'm telling you, whenever folks' money start to dry up on the campaign side, they act very differently. They act very differently.
Well, that could be a whole new conversation here. I got a little inside track on the talk 2 nights ago with the NFL commissioner, and a handful of Black leaders, when they got to the money question, reminding him that taxpayers, our tax dollars, support all these football stadiums and football teams. And when he was told, you know what, you better figure this out, or we're not going to support, we're going to go to city councils and no longer support these stadiums and support people like you. So this isn't just, well, the owners do what they want to do. No, taxpayer dollars are involved here. We can go to the advertisers. We can go to, so that's a whole conversation, Jasmine, you could convene again about money power and economic boycotts, and going to the people, our taxpayer dollars, and business leaders. You know, I was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, and it wasn't all of our moral speaking out, and I was with Desmond Tutu and all the rest. It was when businesses went to Pretoria, to apartheid leaders, and said, we're not going to do this anymore. You better figure this out, because we put sanctions in the conversation. Sanctions got in the conversation, and white business leaders said, no, this isn't going to make us profits anymore. Now, there's a whole conversation there about they kept out some of the economic change that had to happen that we're still dealing with now in South Africa. But it was getting alliance with some of those business people about their profit and power. So that's a bigger conversation that Lashawn's raising there. Powerful one.
I really appreciate the concluding remarks that give some hope and agency to our students, both with respect to the youth movement. Jesselyn, with your conversation about like pressuring our elected leaders and thinking about what it means to hold them accountable, especially when they're not even like they're deciding for people that are not representative of their districts. And then I think, Lashawn, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, money in politics and capitalism and all of it really have its hooks into our democratic process and our democratic institutions. And it's really a challenge, but a real critical point that could make a big difference if we were to look 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because as we've all noted, the next couple of elections are critical and frightful. And I don't mean to end it on that note, but we are over time, and I'm so thankful to have had this robust discussion with Jesselyn McCurdy, Executive Vice President of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, with Lashawn Warren, the Chief Policy Officer for Southern Poverty Law Center, and with Jim Wells, Reverend Jim Wells, the Executive Director of the Faith and Justice Center at Georgetown. Thank you for sharing your time with us tonight, all of you. It's been so illuminating.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.